Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome to this Wednesday, InfoMullet Live, Ask Me Anything. I am Timothy Clancy, your Chief Mulleteer. This is Bonky, the Emotional Support Donkey. And we got a lot going on today. So go ahead, if you haven't yet, like, follow, share this video out to your friends. We're going to be talking about Wave 0.1, or Wave 1.5, I should say, in the US. We're going to be talking about economics, home delinquency, forbearance, those and the impact that's had, plus the jobs report. We're going to get over a little bit to national security affairs with Hong Kong, what's happened just this morning with the new national security law passed by China overnight, and go through a couple media literacies. So it's going to be pretty much a chock full. Again, feel free to ask questions throughout. I've got all the links that I'll be discussing are actually in the discussion notes. Hopefully you can see that. And as always, when we're done, we'll go ahead and post this up as one long YouTube and then break it up into segments so that you can go and share each segment. First of all, quick shout out to all the mulleteers who support us on Patreon. If you haven't become a mulleteer subscriber yet, consider doing that. It's only $5 a month. www.patreon.com/infomullet. Also, big shout out to a mulleteer data science team, Jerry Spalding, supported on, I guess I should say, on the drums and bass guitar. Jerry's the front man of the data science team, but supported by Krista and Nick. So it's a lot of the apps we're doing today are put in place by Jerry, and so give him a shout out if he shows up. So let's go ahead and get started with what everyone's talking about, which is Wave 1.5. Finally, you know, we've been talking about it for months, and everyone's like, well, Tim, are you sure there's going to be a Wave 1.5? I'm like, just wait for it. Are you sure? Just wait for it. And here we are. So, I mean, we're now at, I kind of, one of the messages I put out to this was sort of a get your 50K hats out. And that's kind of a reference to when the Dow breaks 20,000 or 25,000 or 30,000, people like, get your 30,000 hat off. This is obviously not something to celebrate, but it's very likely now nationwide, we're going to break 50,000 new cases a day over the weekend of 4th of July weekend. That's if testing keeps up. Probably yesterday or the day before, under congressional testimony, Dr. Fauci actually predicted we might get to 100,000 new cases a day. So the really unfortunate thing, the high level is, in some ways, we're back to step one. It's almost like, you know, when we were in March and we had an uncontrolled outbreak in New Jersey and New York, the supercluster there, we were going through these questions of hospitalization, flatten the curve. That's now beginning to happen nationally. Now, some states, they're seeing declines, but because there are so many different states and so many different regions that are experiencing outbreaks, it's like the entire country is resetting back to the beginning of the hammer and the dance. But we've already been through the hammer. We never started the dance, and we're really in kind of a tough shape. Now, people have asked why I call it Wave 1.5. And I wanted to kind of describe that, because there's been this question of, well, is this just the second wave? You know, we had the first wave and people talk about the second wave. So when we look at behavior modes for pandemics and in the systems thinking, we do a lot with behavior modes in general, not just pandemics, but like economics, business cycles, all that. A wave is defined by a peak, the crest, and a trough. And the peak is at its high point and the trough is its minimal low point. And of course, this depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at a county or a zip code or a city or a state or a country or a world, all of these could have different wave patterns. Traditionally, a wave is defined as when you have a trough low point, it goes up to a peak and it goes back down to that trough low point. Since the trough is the minimal point, if it doesn't go back down to where it started from, it's not technically a wave. And what I mean by that is, you see some countries that have done this well. South Korea, they went from 0 infections per day, they had up to a peak, and then it's down, and they've had many days with 0 infections. Some are not at 0, like Germany's not at 0 by any stretch, but it's very close. And we're talking about a scale of thousands of infections a day. Having a few dozen new infections a day is close enough to say, okay, they've had their wave 1. But in the US, we had 0 infections. We got the first outbreak. We went up to our peak. We dropped, and then we only dropped partway back down that initial ramp up. And we stayed flat there for most of May and June, really, and you started to see the acceleration. I began calling wave 1.5 returning as we were heading into Memorial Day weekend, and then it began accelerating, and now it's really prevalent. So this is why you see this discussion for me, wave 1.5. We've never left wave 1. It's a continuation. And the problem it means is at the rate of infections we have now and the rate of spread we have now, I don't really see how we can control this other than very drastic measures, which, you know, there's not really a lot of political will necessarily because the death rate's low. And we're going to get into why that is and what's going to happen. The problem is, as always, just like we were talking about March, the reality of where we're at now is based off what happened 2 weeks ago. And if we're thinking about, well, let's wait to make a decision until things get worse in 2 weeks, we're already going to be actually further out. So there's always this time delay in effect. And we can see how some of this plays out. You know, the deaths are still very low. I mean, relatively low. We're averaging about 300 to 400 deaths a day right now. I keep track of this every day. I'm not posting the charts as much because we're out of the initial, what I thought would be the wave 1 surge. We're still averaging 300 to 400 deaths a day. It's very low. We were at 1,500 to 2,000 deaths throughout most of April and into part of May. And last week, there was one day that spikes up. So if anyone saw a day last week, there was 2,400 deaths. Like, oh, what's going on? New Jersey did one of these dumps that New York City did, or New York did as well, where they said, here's the probable presumptive COVID cases that we're pretty sure are COVID, backlogged over a period of time. They added them to a single day, and it caused that one to artificially rise up. I marked these in the chart. So we're not at 2,000 a day yet. And so there's this real dissonance of we got 45,000 new cases a day, but we don't have a high death, and that's making it problematic, or it's difficult to people to understand, why do I need to do all these measures? No one's dying, it's not really bad. Part of that is because the pipeline of the hospital, again, we're back to ground, the sort of day one. Back in March, we were worrying about flattening the curve, and we're right back in that point. And what we're going to show today as we get through this is that we're filling up the hospital capacity. So no, there's not a lot of deaths because we haven't reached that capacity limit yet, but we're getting close in a couple states. Before I get into that though, I wanted to share, so for a media literacy standpoint, there's this question that goes around and you hear a lot, well, isn't the higher infection rate just because of more tests? And there's this positive testing media literacy that I want to get on. So you've seen this chart before. It comes from Calculated Risk Blog, where I get a lot of my charts on economics, but they also do a good job of tracking the daily testing totals and the positive daily test rate. So you can see here, to clear the chart, these are the tests per day on the left, on the bottom is the calendar, and then on the right is the percent positive. And this gives you a lot of good information from a nationwide level. You can see here how we really struggled to get positive testing up to where we needed to, and it was very low, and then it stayed flat here for most of April. So when we should have been accelerating testing in April, it stayed flat, and you see these very high positive percentage rates. And remember, with testing, the lower your positive rate is, the better your sufficiency of testing. I'm going to explain why that is in a second, because that throws a lot of people off. But then after April, we actually have a good steady run of increasing testing capacity. And we're now up to almost 650,000 a day. And you can see the positive rate of that. So the positive rate is of, if we do 100,000 tests, how many are positive? You see it dropping down. And we talk about you want to be under 3%. And we got close to it here, but look in the last couple weeks, it starts increasing again. Now, and we're now right now close to 6%, maybe 7%, and it's kind of, it looks like it's increasing even as we're increasing tests. So what does this mean? Why is a low positive testing rate important for understanding whether the virus is expanding or not? And I use an analogy. You go to one of those cable TV shows. I don't know what it's called. They're fishing ice crab, right? It's the Alaska fishermen. They're on their boats. It's in the winter. It looks absolutely miserable. Anytime I think my job is bad, I turn that show on and I suddenly feel better about myself and my job choices. But in that show, they're putting pots over the side of the boat in hope of hitting a crab mass that's on the ocean floor, and they're putting in 100 pots, and they bring them up and they look at how many crabs are in each pot. Well, remember, they can't see where the crabs are because it's at the bottom of the ocean floor. So they're just kind of testing these pots in, hoping to hit the crab mass. Think about it. If every pot they pull up is full of crab, they're probably center mass of that whole range of crab. I don't know what it's called, a herd of crab, whatever it is. They're probably in the middle of it, or there's plenty of it. They certainly haven't overfished it. If they start pulling up pots that have fewer and fewer crabs in it, or no crabs at all, they're getting to the boundaries of that large body mass of crabs, or they've fished it out. So think about the number of crabs in the pot as being like the positive rate. If every time you're pulling up a sample from these tests and it's full of crabs or has a high positive, that means you're nowhere near the boundaries or the edges of the outbreak. You're not testing enough and getting it broad enough to have some pots come back with very few crabs. If you throw enough pots in the water, you're putting 1,000 pots in. Yeah, you may have some that are full of crabs, but at the edges and the boundaries, you start having fewer crabs. That's like the lowering positive test rate. It tells us that we're getting close to finding the boundaries of, and in this case, it's not a crab mass, it's the boundaries of an active outbreak or contagion. And until we get that number below 5%, ideally around 3%, we're not really, we don't know how big this outbreak is. And Arizona right now is over 20%. A lot of states are at 10%. So nationwide, there's kind of a mix. Someone asked on the thing, why is it 3%? That comes from the studies that have come out of the countries that have gone through this, where the positive testing rate was when they began to get a control on the contagion. So that's why the positive test rate. So media literacy, they say, well, this is just because of increased testing. That would be true if the positive test rate was staying low, but the positive test rate is going up, which means we're back in this thing where there's probably a lot more crabs on the ocean floor, or in this case, infected people. And remember, just because they're being tested positive now and we're finding them doesn't mean they aren't any less infectious or contagious than anyone we didn't catch before. So it's kind of curious to say, well, it's not really, it's still bad whether they're positive or not, that they're still going to be spreading the pandemic. The question is, how much are we aware of it, and what is that positive testing rate describe for us as how close we are to finding those boundaries. So let's jump into here. So where does that leave us now for the country as a whole? So this is the InfoMullet page. If you go there today, the top pinned post is our tracking. Jerry did a lot of work over the weekend. I want to give him another shout out. All our apps, we have over 12 applications now that track all this stuff for COVID-19. You can see states, hospitalization rates, remaining hospital beds. This is a new one we're going to go into. You can do comparisons by states. We also have global stats. It has all the methodology and how we calculate this and all the fancy stuff there. But what I wanted to show was, this is one of the new features we've added, is we now track statewide and at the national level the available of hospital beds and ICU beds remaining, so we can track this capacity. So you think about, yes, we have this growing outbreak. We got 50,000 cases a day, but we're only seeing 300 deaths. Why is that? It's because there's still capacity in the hospital system for treating those cases. And this is the US overall. And this is a primary chart where you can pull up any state, and you'll see, to clear the chart, because this is the percent of beds free or patients. And so this lower line here, these are the suspected COVID patients in any one entity. So this is US, about a little less than 10, getting back up 5%. So probably 6% of all patients nationwide right now are suspected of being COVID-19. Up at the top here, you see these two lines. This is, the blue is hospital beds, just any bed whatsoever. The green is ICU bed, and this is the percent capacity remaining. So think of this as the free percent. If you had no patients in the hospital, this would be up at 100%. If you had no beds left, this would be at 0%. And what you see is nationwide, and it goes back every 60 days. This is coming from the CDC. They update 3 times a week, so it's fairly accurate, but it is an estimate. If you actually look at the CDC data, they have a 95% confidence limit on either side. We didn't include those for clarity. This is the midpoint. But you see this general decline in capacity, and it's got this same oscillating behavior here, which is the weekend pattern that you'll see in the deaths, and that there's there tends to be this regular oscillation in hospital usage. But you can pull up any state. So I'm going to pull up Arizona here, and you can see Arizona was, in May, they were doing fine. They had 60%, it's almost off the charts, literally, 60% ICU bed availability, 45% hospital bed availability, and under, they're at 7%, 6 or 7% COVID patients. But you can see as wave 1.5 came into Arizona and increased, remember, they're at that exploding rate, and they're at, I think, 20% positive test rate. If this was just, well, we're testing more, so more people are infected, it's not really a big deal, you wouldn't see the hospitalization increase. But look at what happens. Hospitalization rate is increasing and is now nearly 20% of all patients in Arizona are COVID-19. And what that does is it is dragging down the available capacity of hospital beds and ICU beds. And you can see this very clearly here as it's declining, and you can see that the ICU was much higher and now it's dropping, which reflects kind of the severe nature sometimes of COVID. And now ICU actually has less capacity than the hospital beds. And you can look at states that have been through this. Let's bring up New York. New York's the opposite. You see New York here. Remember, they had their super cluster in late March and April. They actually are increasing capacity in their ICU beds as their COVID patients go down. So unfortunately, the data for the CDC doesn't go back into the height of the super cluster in late March and April, but you can kind of get a feel of what wrong looks like. New York is coming out of that super cluster. They're over 20% patients. They have they probably had closer to 25% capacity, and they are steadily growing out of it. Now, they flatlined in the hospital beds, which is normal. You're going to have a normal amount. But the ICU beds, the surplus, that shows that their patients are decreasing, their ICU bed surplus is decreasing. That's good. You can do this for any state. You can pull up any state on this and do it. But you can also pull up comparisons. So here's New Jersey and New York as a percent of inpatients suspected or confirmed with COVID. Again, it goes back to May, and you can see they're declining here from a height. Now, New Jersey, it was later, so this is actually closer to the center mass of their supercluster. They were over 33%. What you can do, because these are comparison charts, is you can add California, Florida, and Texas, which are the 3 most populous states in the nation. New York's the 4th. And you can see here, this is why this disconnect over wave 1.5 formed, right? California, Florida, and Texas are all at very low patient amounts, and they're now increasing. And you've had this cross that occurs at sort of mid-June here, and they're now rising up to about 10%. They're not, this is statewide, and so this is somewhat, don't get confused. There's some counties in Texas that are much worse than this and some that will be much better, but the average is 10%. Remember, in the supercluster phase, we were at 20% patients, and we're heading that way gradually. You can also look at, here is the hospital beds that are free. And again, you've got New York and New Jersey. You can add California, Florida, Texas, and you can see there's a gradual decline with some sharp decreases here over time. But and this is for just hospital beds in general. But again, ICU beds is the key. So let's look at ICU bed comparisons. New York, New Jersey, again, you see that increasing capacity as they come out of their supercluster. Their wave is behind them. Pull up California, Florida, and Texas, and you can start to see that decline. Here's Texas, 46% 2 months ago, now down to about 35%. So it's dropped 10%. This is, again, statewide. There are certain states, or certain counties in Texas that are already at capacity or getting close to it. I think Houston, the county Houston's in close. Los Angeles County is getting very close. Let me go see. So let me pause here and see, because there's been some questions here. Mark, I'll get to your question of travel after a second. I want to go through. Just reading questions here. Testing being good but not preventing the spread. Is the testing increase antibody tests and not PCR? Erez, you asked that question. I don't know if you came in late. I went through a whole section on how to understand positive test rate and why a high positive test rate isn't good. That will be on the video, so you may want to go back and look at that. The tests right now that we're referring to are confirmed tests for COVID-19. It shouldn't include antibody tests. There have been some calculated risk has pulled out some of the numbers that were when they identified confirmed positive rates in those testing numbers for antibodies. There were some states that were erroneously including them. The CDC did it. Those are not huge numbers. They're problematic because they shouldn't be in there. You shouldn't mix antibody test results with positive confirmed case. The positive you have COVID is you literally have it right now. It's active. You're infectious. An antibody test is you've had it in the past and you have some level of antibody. Those had been mixed in some states. It's not huge. The bulk of the test is simply that we're ramping up the testing ability and getting better data. So Kevin's asking on the wave, isn't it kind of likely that every area will surge and then grow out of it? New York City surged first because of population density. Florida and Georgia, Texas are surging later now because of sloppy reopening. Point being, walking between the raindrops was a bad idea from the beginning. Just about everyone is going to get this big. Not necessarily, Kevin. So you saw, I mean, it is true. So first of all, you're right. The COVID-19 hits in clusters. And New York certainly had its cluster. It raised and now it's dropping. The problem is the percentage of all people in New York who got it still remains fairly low. There's differing estimates of how that is, but think about herd immunity when we don't have to think about this anymore, is usually it's accomplished by vaccines. 80% of the people thereabouts have either had it or gotten a vaccine to it. That's when you have enough people in the population that it won't reinfect. New York City dropped because it implemented harsh measures and controlling measures. And as you pointed out, as states released their harsh measures, they've had new surges. The risk now, though, is if you have a transfer from a high case state from, remember, all the areas that are in the South now came from other areas in the U.S. spreading there gradually. It wasn't so much for foreign travel that got shut down. There was still a little bit, but mainly it was, from the super clusters coming out, you would have places where there was not herd immunity surging up. That can happen in reverse. So Texas can bring back to New York or Florida or Idaho or, we're a country that we report in states, but the highway system is very well developed and people love to drive. I was looking at an economic chart of miles driven and it's been on an increase, and you can see as people get back on the road and start driving, those people are moving around and there's the chance to reinfect. So the problem is it's like whack-a-mole. It's probably a better analogy is whack-a-mole. As long as you have large areas outbreaking, there's a risk of reinfecting previous outbreak areas because they don't have enough of the population with antibodies yet to resist that. The way you minimize that is you either have good contact testing and tracing in your area. So New York says, oh, we had 10 people fly in from Florida, but we caught them, we traced everyone, and we put those people in quarantine. That's the purpose of the dance. A bad way gets into this discussion of travel bans. The whole travel ban concept that's been discussed here in the thread, I want to touch on it briefly. It is not constitutional to pick out a certain class of people and ban them from travel. And this happened to some governors early on in the pandemic. They would say, well, I don't like New York. You're banned from travel. Like Florida was great. Florida's like, hey, New Yorkers, come on down for spring break. As soon as spring break was over, like, oh, no New Yorkers travel. There's a very capricious sort of travel ban, but you can't pick a single criteria out and say, we're not going to allow New York. What you can do under the quarantine laws is you can say, if your state has a level of outbreak above X, some sort of objective measure, we're going to impose a quarantine on you. I generally don't think these are all that effective, mainly because the primary risks of contagion are, if you don't have local procedures, banning people from flying in aren't going to keep people from driving around, and you're still going to have these outbreaks. They're sort of like trying to ban travel is sort of like a cheat code, but it's a cheat code that doesn't work very well. And so that was a great question from Kevin on the constitutional travel ban. The authority for quarantine itself is constitutional. And I think this was Rory and Mark were talking about it. I don't want to go back too much because I want to get onto some of the other stuff. But you talk about, is there a lawful authority to institute quarantine? Yes, from the very early. You can go back to court cases from the 1700s. I mean, remember, they dealt with smallpox. They understood quarantines. This has been a well-developed, when it comes to constitutional law, this is no Third Amendment that's never had a case, right? Quarantine law is really well developed. And there are certain authorities, the executive authorities, that's the governor of the state and the president, executive branch, obviously, they have the authority to institute quarantines. How they institute it is the constitutional test that comes up, and how they establish their criteria of who gets to do what. A flat out, so you can quarantine an individual person to a house very easily, which is a sort of reactive quarantine. This person has the infection, we're going to quarantine. That's the traditional method of quarantine. The preventive quarantine, the sort of what we call the lockdown procedures, that's more recent, and it gets tricky because you generally, the courts want you to be doing it consistently, like across all groups. So this kind of phased, this group gets to do it or this group doesn't, have run afoul. But there is, at a base level, constitutional authority for a public health emergency, just like there's constitutional authority to call out the National Guard. There are constitutional authorities for dealing with public health emergencies. The implication or the implementations of them get a bit tricky, and that might be a good topic for a follow-up. But I wanted to get, we got a lot more on the plate here, so I wanted to get to that. We asked someone asked last week about, well, first of all, before I jump off this, are there any more questions about we are the same in Ireland? Oh, Sinead's talking about travel between the European Union and the UK. Yeah, European Union's ban travel from the UK. Hawaii, yeah, Rory brings up Hawaii's travel ban includes all travelers. That's the way that is a constitutionally defensible way to say, look, all travelers, period. It's easy. When you start getting in state by state, you get a little tricky, and I think they're going to run afoul. It's also symbolic. I mean, if you're the governor of a state that's flailing and you don't know what to do, you're going to say, well, I'll ban travel from XYZ. It's like, no, hire contact tracers, get your act together, jump on top of it. What Erez is asking, what level of testing would you expect to need for contact tracing to be effective, or is it an issue of building out the logistics and isolating those who test positive? So Erez, there are, and I hope I'm getting that pronounced correctly, there are two metrics. You want a testing positive rate below 3%. That tells you you're testing enough. Contact tracers, you need about 30 tracers per 100,000 population to have enough staff to then, when you find the people, to effectively trace them. Very few states are close to that. You'll see a link in the bottom. If you go down in the links areas, you'll see a website called Test and Trace. It has a map of the US where every state's positive rate and their current hiring rate for or staffing rate for contact tracers is displayed out. That will tell you state by state which states are doing good or not on that. So last week, someone asked, Mark Saketa asked about the hospital revenue model, and this was part of the media literacy about hospital revenues and coronavirus, and is it true that they're getting their money from misreporting coronavirus? Well, I dug into it a little bit more, and when you think about what constitutes hospital revenue, there's two ways to think about it. One of which is, of all interactions, emergency and non-emergency, on average, non-emergencies are worth $700 or more than emergencies. So people coming in with emergency COVID just by averages, but that's kind of not useful because it includes so many interactions. If you look at it by type of procedures, the top 10 revenue sort of generating procedures for hospitals, it's like cardiovascular surgery, cardiology, neurosurgery, orthopedic, gastroenterology, hematology and oncology, general, internal medicine, pulmonology, and cardiology. So none of those are emergencies. Like, I mean, they can be related to emergencies, but these are all what would generally be considered either, you know, life-saving or elective, in that they're not an emergency necessarily, but you need to have it for like cancer, heart surgery, things like that. All of those are now stopped, or at least less. And it gets into, there's a report that was put out by the American Hospital Association where I was able to quantify the impacts to hospitals of COVID-19. Now, of course, they're a lobbying group, so take that with a grain of salt, but their numbers tend to be fairly legit because they got a lot of people looking at them. So they're a useful bellwether. I wouldn't say it's exact, but it's close. And you can get an idea of how COVID has impacted hospitals, and this myth that, well, hospitals are just going to report more COVID because that's going to get a lot more money for them. It all goes back to April 7th. There was a Congress critter, a Republican, and the CARES Act had just been passed, which I think gave a 20% boost for Medicaid. And what he said, you can go back and check, he said, this presents an avenue for increased billing. He didn't really provide any evidence for that. It was just a statement. it's never been documented or demonstrated, but from that April 7th interview, there's been this whole media conspiracy thing that hospitals are just going to make money hand over fist by reporting coronavirus. Well, the reality is a little different. So the AHA estimates that just for COVID-19 hospitalizations alone, when you look at what they get paid for by Medicare, including the 20% uptick from the CARES Act, they lose $36 billion over the last 4 months. And that's because anyone who's worked in a hospital with Medicare reimbursement knows that the Medicare reimbursement rarely covers all that you need. It's why private insurance is so expensive. It's got to make up the difference, right? You balance out your private insurance payments with your Medicare payments, because Medicare reimbursement almost never covers the actual costs. So just in COVID-19 alone, if that was the only business the hospital did across the country, it'd be out $40 billion. But much more, all those surgeries I just listed, those revenue ones, those have largely been canceled. So the revenue losses from canceled surgeries is about 160 billion over 4 months. So you've got a net cost of dealing with COVID is negative. You've lost 160 billion more revenue from not doing surgeries. You've spent probably 2.5 billion on PPE and additional safety procedures. And then there's the sort of additional services you need to provide for your workers, transportation, daycare, things like that, that they, again, not all hospitals, I'm not trying to make hospitals out to be saints. Some hospitals have treated their workers really bad, but the estimate is about $2.2 billion spent just on these additional frontline worker services. So the total, and this is from March through June, is a little over $250 billion lost from COVID, or about, they're averaging 40 to 50 billion a month. So they're not making money. And the problem they're facing now as we get into wave 1.5, it's not ending, right? This is, as that hospital capacity decreases, you're not going to have all these pending surgeries suddenly flood back in. So the hospitals are in a real problem with that. And that's, so that kind of puts another nail in the coffin of the whole, does Medicare reimbursement mean that people are misreporting things? Short answer, no. So from one media literacy to another media literacy, and this one's kind of more on the blue side, this chart drove me nuts this week. I saw this chart everywhere. Hopefully some people saw this. I might put it on the info. This is a chart that claims to show that socialized medicine, they basically, the chart is like, look at all these, and these are what waves look like. And they're like, oh, look, the United States is up here, for-profit healthcare bad, socialized medicine down here, really good. And it comes from this website called Common Dreams that I think Ed described as all the quality of the Drudge Report, but less original content. So this chart actually isn't created by them. It's not even from the CDC. If you when you go to their website, they claim this is from the CDC. The actual charting application comes from the European Union CDC, so they botched that. And the original chart was simply showing that as a pandemic response, right, these countries are closer to their wave 1 troughs. Again, we talked about wave 1 trough, right? Look, you start low, you hit a peak, and you get back down towards that low. That's what a wave looks like. US, wave 1.5, you start at a trough, you get to a peak, you go down a little, you're back up to your next peak. You haven't had that decline to trough. And the problem is anyone who's been following the infomullet and sees that these countries like France, United Kingdom, and Italy, as examples of socialized medicine has made these countries successful, doesn't know what they're talking about. It is completely wrong. The United Kingdom has performed worse. France has performed worse. Italy has performed worse. These are some of the worst countries. Now, Australia and Canada have done very well. But it gets into this kind of myth that, and this is, again, it's a website promoting socialized medicine, not surprise. But there's this myth that the hospital healthcare system model in a country was a useful predictor of their success in dealing with the pandemic, and that is completely wrong. So of course, let's go to the data. I put this chart together. On the top, from left to right, most socialized is the kinds of healthcare. So universal government funded, that's the NHS in the United Kingdom. The government pays for all healthcare. It's socialized medicine. And then you go down, universal public insurance, universal public-private insurance, universal private health insurance, non-universal insurance. And so you can rate countries sort of 5 to 1, 5 being the most socialized healthcare, 1 being the least. And then we can look at the countries, and I just pulled some out here. I marked in yellow the ones that were on the chart. And this is from the New York Times. This is from this morning, right? The country, its deaths per 100,000 what its healthcare system is, and the equivalent deaths that would be in the US. And right away, you realize United Kingdom and Italy, we're at 128,000 deaths in the US. If we were the United Kingdom, we'd be 217,000 deaths right now. That is not an indication that socialized medicine did all that much in United Kingdom, because the pandemic response they chose was the wrong one. They went with induced herd immunity. They completely ignored the advice. They reversed it. They botched it, and they really suffered for it. Again, France and the United States are closer. Now, we may catch up to these over time because we're still increasing and they've done their waves. But again, these results are not, I mean, you can look through there and there's no real correlation. Austria, very low, not socialized medicine. Israel, even lower. You know, you even have here Jordan and Indonesia, not exactly high resource countries. They have non-universal and they've had very low. So the thing that matters, that this media literacy I want to get across, it's not whether your healthcare system is socialized or private or anything like that. It has to do with what pandemic response did you choose, when did you put it in place, and how effective were you at implementing that. And what's just funny to me is a lot of the ones on that chart are really bad because they're not the examples. Like if I were going to pick one that did well, I'd pick Germany, Israel, South Korea. You know, I'd pick those ones, but those aren't all socialized medicine. So that wanted to get that out of the way because that's been bugging me on Facebook. Let's go back to the questions. Tyler Brown's asking, taking the other direction, underreporting cases like what is happening in Florida, Georgia, firing scientists who once say money. This seems criminal. Why is it not? Is it just politics as usual, pushing the economy must reopen narrative? So, Tyler, this gets to a deeper question of the independence of civil servants in a government system. So for most of the United States history, and I'll get up to your point at the current time very quickly, but for most of the United States history up until 1900s, you had basically civil service jobs were political bounty for whoever won the election. They'd staff their friends, and you couldn't question the politician in charge because they'd simply fire you. You'll hear these described as Tammany Hall, and Tammany is a New York guy who was horrible at this. There was a major civil service reform during the progressive era in the first part of the 20th century at both a federal and a state level that tried to insulate and protect civil service workers. And what you got was basically there would be career civil service workers who would specialize in their function and not be politically motivated or politically incented. And above them, from a leadership standpoint, there would be political appointees. And you see this both at the executive level and at the state level. What's happened is the independence of the civil service has eroded over the last couple of years. And this is, I mean, it's been an ongoing trend, but it's really accelerated in the most recent administration. And those barriers and protections are breaking down. Is it criminal? That's really tricky because a government always has the ability to hire and fire people, but there are supposed to be protections in place for civil service that they're protected from retaliation. However, if you're claiming retaliation in a political act, you have to make that case with a lawsuit, and at that point, you're suing the government. It's not impossible, but it's a very long, very in-depth, very drawn out. We'll find out. I mean, you can see this again when you look at Bridgegate in New Jersey with that whole thing and the firings that came out of that and the results, the lawsuits. It can go on for years before we know definitively. Can we say that this was probably political retaliation? Yeah, Florida's done a really strong effort to try and make their situation look less worse than it is. Is it criminal? That's going to be for a grand jury to decide. Certainly, it doesn't look like the protections were in place, but it's not helping them. This is the thing. It's not helping Florida at all to fire their chief data scientist. It hasn't prevented them from having a huge outbreak. All they've done is they've now got someone, I think she's now got her own website that has her own dashboard of metrics on it, regardless of the state, and they have an outbreak. So it's one of these things where when politicians violate these rules thinking they're going to protect their reputation, they're not. Had he just, had DeSantis actually listened and followed the advice, he may not be in such a bad state right now with an outbreak. Rory mentioned states like Hawaii are in the process of hiring contact tracers using the ratio of 30 to 100. Yeah, Hawaii has been a really good example of this. What the processes are, or what right looks like. Hawaii's been a great example, and they're looking to open up and travel as August with the help of additional contract. And obviously Hawaii's in a bit of a unique state in that they only have to worry. They know pretty much where all the people are coming from. There's no driving to Hawaii. Boat traffic's probably limited, although the cruise liners might be fairly large. That's a large population. But in most ways you can control who's going in. If you're a state that's connected by freeways, that's a lot trickier when you've got people moving all over, especially pent-up demand is bursting out. And we're going to talk about pent-up demand now and the economy as we switch a little bit to what's going on in the economy. So last week, someone asked about the trends in forbearance and delinquency in home loans and rental agreements and things like that. So I pulled up some data to look at this, because remember, coinciding with the reopening was this belief we'll have this economic rebound. And they're doing it. I mean, again, it is a false dichotomy to say that we need to prioritize people's health or the economy. Whoever's making an argument in favor of either is missing the point. The economy and the people are one. The economy does not run without people. It does not run without confidence. And people don't run without the economy after a certain amount of time. You can't really divide them and say, well, we're going to, it's okay to have no economy and people. That doesn't work for a while. It certainly doesn't work if you say, well, it's okay to have economy and no people. You know, that doesn't work either. So what happened was, as these states reopened, you began to get some movement, but we're now starting to see the data come in on this forbearance and delinquency question. So I wanted to pull up some charts. These come from Calculated Risk. As I said, Calculated Risk blog is really my go-to spot for economic charting. They do a great job. Their links are in there. I'd go check them out. So when you think about the ladder of economics and real estate, if you don't own your house, you start as a renter. You pay renter to a landlord or a landlord's agency. That landlord is the next step up on the ladder. They often don't own their own property. If they own their own property, they take it, they pocket the money, but they often pay a part of that rent to a mortgage processor. The mortgage processor is now the third tier. The mortgage processor usually pays to a bank that owns the note, and the bank that owns the note has to pay out and show a return for its investors, and often for the government, because the government's backing the loan. So when you think about this cascading chain, you can't just isolate one piece of it without having a ripple effect. However, one of the good news stories is that while Congress was going on all these stimulus stuff, the Federal Reserve moved in at the top level and went to the banks and said, we will keep you from collapse. Because think about it, if you're a bank and you're not receiving your mortgage payments from tens of thousands of people, you're right back to where we were perhaps in the worst of the financial crisis. You're looking at liquidity, you're looking at insolvency, and worse is the confidence of your traders or your people engaging the bank drops. You're going to have a real problem at the bank. So the Fed said to the banks, we have your back. We will not let, we will offer literally trillions of dollars of loans to backstop you so you don't have to collapse because of COVID. None of those loans have been made on the Fed. They didn't even have to be made. This is a sophistication of the Fed. The Fed said, simply by making it public that we will protect you, they cut out the confidence trap loop that went down and destroyed Bear Stearman's and Lehman Brothers, where people said no one's going to bail them out, they're going to go, and they just went down the toilet. Well, underneath that, you still have to have protection for the mortgage processors that are paying the banks. Fannie and Freddie finally did that. And at the bottoms up, you have governors that are like, hey, rent, we're going to do rent forgiveness or rent freeze or things like that. And that protects both the renters and the landlords. Remember, if the renters don't have to pay rent, but the landlords still have to pay the mortgage, well, it's still a problem. So you've got two efforts at the top of the bottom. And what you see, the first thing is they're very quick to move into forbearance. Forbearance is a form of delinquency that's kind of like a permission slip. It's like, we know you're in delinquency. It's okay. It's not going to hurt you. So forbearance is like a predecessor step to delinquency, even though it's technically delinquency. Like if you're in a forbearance program, it's not going to hit your credit rating. It's not going to be a negative. And you can see here that the historical amount here is March 2nd. We're talking about fractions of a percentage point. And you can see the forbearance increase as the Fed began its programs. And these are the different types: Ginnie Mac, Fannie, Freddie, other private, and the total. You can see the level. So Ginnie is the highest at almost 10% of the entire portfolio of Ginnie loans are now in some sort of forbearance. That means there's no money coming in, but we're okay with that because it's a structured forbearance and we know it, right? That's different than I was expecting money, I didn't get money. All the way down to 6.2, Fannie and Freddie is the lowest. So you see here the forbearance, which is a leading indicator of delinquency. Now these are, this is the entire portfolio and it's backed by the government for the most part. So this could include some private, but it's mainly homes and things like that. Delinquency is after 3 months of failure to pay, when you're not in a forbearance program, you're called in delinquency, or you're in foreclosure. So this chart is calculated risk chart that this is the percent of single family loans that are in delinquency. This is a yearly chart. So each one of these things down here is a year. And you can see here, they've color coded. The blues are the major recessions. And you can see here, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and you can see the financial crisis of 2000, really it begins 2007. You can see it take off and accelerate with the housing collapse. So you can see the sort of historical bad news delinquency rates as they increase. And we've of course been working through that, and we're sort of getting through that. You're only just now beginning to see a blip up in delinquency. And that will probably increase a lot more, because one of the definitions of delinquency is you're 3 months over without paying. So we're at July 1st now. If you stopped paying your rent in April and haven't paid it April, May, June, you're just going to show up in next month's delinquency report, in the July report. So this isn't really an accurate, this is a bit of a time lag right now. That forbearance is a leading indicator, but remember, those are permission. The delinquency will probably be less than that, and because we have a good forbearance system and a good backing in place with the rent freezes at the bottom level and the protection of the lenders at the higher level, I don't think we're going to see the pressure to sort of that we saw with the housing collapse. And that's probably a good news thing, because we really, anything we can do to keep the economy stable while we're doing this is really important. The other half of this is the jobs report came out today. So the jobs report, people were looking at last month's job report and it had a sharp increase. Well, it was the consensus for, let me pull this up here. The consensus for today is, this is this is private sector from ADP. So this is based off salary payments that ADP processes. They estimate the number of jobs added or lost. The consensus estimate was about 3 million jobs added, and for the unemployment rate to decrease to 12.3%. They added about 2.3 million jobs in May and June. So it was less than what was anticipated, but it's a big number that was added. And this is because you see states reopening and things like that. Now, there is a little bit of question in the BLS numbers. They'll come out on Friday, I think. The BLS is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's the government source that does the same kind of measure. The government source has a way of testing you were employed, but you weren't able to go to work, and that's that's probably a better thing for people who are sort of because the businesses are closed. But it shows that there are signs of the economy returning to life. The problem is this is under a period of time, May through June, when everything's reopening, right? This is not even in June yet. So this is going to have that potential oscillating faction where the confidence get crashed. If these businesses went out and rehired, they got some commerce in, the outbreak spread like wildfire, and now they have to close again, or they have to come down, or people begin withdrawing their consumer activity, you're going to be right back into the same problem we were in April, May, except now you have even worse confidence because the businesses are kind of like once burned, twice shy. And next week, what I'll probably do next week or the week after is I'll take a look. There's some high frequency indicators in the economy that really tell you very well, better than the government, analysis of how the economy is doing. It's miles driven, it's restaurant occupancy rate, it's hotel occupancy rate, it's travel, it's movie sales. I know Tyler has been tracking the movie. There's a certain movie he's tracking, when it's going to come out or not. These indicators tend to be barometers of economic velocity, and you could see them drop dramatically for COVID, stay flat, but now they were coming back up. And so if you're having a V-shaped recovery, let's pretend there's no pandemic, you want to see them come back up fast. That's a good sign. The problem here is with the renewed outbreak of 1.5, are they going to go up and then reverse and come back down? And that's something we're going to have to see. Kevin, I don't necessarily, Kevin's bringing up a good point, so I want to do it on the economy, is that there is an implied balance. He says, our response made a lot of worst case scenario assumptions and prioritized people over the economy far beyond what was warranted. We would have been better off with a more balanced risk-based approach, in my opinion. I understand that. I think that's a valid point. I disagree in part because of the first of all, the worst case are simply at the far end of a range of worst case scenarios. There's a whole lot of less worst cases. And I think we actually reacted to the less worst case more than we did the worst case. But more importantly, we've seen the Americans, remember, the lockdown the effect on the economy didn't happen because of the lockdown. It's because people were scared. They were scared that they were going to get sick, infected, and suffer consequences. They actually, when you look at the cell phone tracking data and the other information, I've shared this before in an info mullet, the American economy shut itself down on the same week that Trump had the horrible press conference the Wednesday night. The travel ban went in place, the NBA canceled, Coachella canceled. These are all private actor decisions. This is before, I think California had locked down a few cities and New York had yet to lock down. But this is the week the stock market dropped by a bunch. None of these signals were engineered by any committee or government. But in reaction to these signals, the Americans withdrew themselves from the economic thing, and that's when you began seeing the economic hardship. After that, legal lockdowns occurred, which sort of put a imprint of authority on it, and people tracked to those. But I think, again, the economy and the people are inseparable. If people don't have confidence they're going to be safe, they're not going to engage in the economy. So I think what this shows in March, at least, is that people had enough fear to withdraw to the point that we had this severe impact. Simply, we could say that we weren't going to put in lockdowns, but that wouldn't have necessarily restored the confidence. And we're in a point now where confidence has been restored because there's been kind of this public assurance campaign, but now confidence is being eroded again. So it's going to be interesting to see. I do agree from the balance perspective that we need to have the capabilities in place with the dance, where we're doing testing and tracing effectively, so we can have the economy open. That's what the countries that are succeeding are doing. That's the balance I think you and I both agree we need to get to, is where you don't have to have lockdowns because you've got a small enough outbreak and you've got enough capability to manage it. You can keep it open and just deal with the exceptions. So Abigail's asking, what about rent freezes that end in July? Will they be extended? I don't know, Abigail. That's going to be, rent freezes are going to be a local decision by mayors or state governors. And again, we're back, as I was saying at the beginning, we're back to stage one. We'll have 50,000 cases a day, probably sometime through 4th of July. So, any plans that we had of this ending over the summer, I think, are gone. The question is, will the death count return, or will we be able to, now that it's nationwide, our hospital capacity going to stay in place? That's the real question. If we can avoid the death count, maybe some things will open up, but it's just with so many infections spreading, it's going to be hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So good questions. I'm going to do a quick segue over here. Quick segue into national security. Go ahead and keep popping up questions. I'm going to get back here for a second. But big news in national security for Hong Kong. For those who don't know, July 1st is not only Canada Day, go Canada, it's also the commemoration of the turnover from from Britain to China of the Hong Kong. So, quick historical backgrounder for those who don't know. Britain acquired Hong Kong during the Opium Wars, where it was sort of used its naval power and sort of drug trade and things like that, was able to acquire and manage as a British colony Hong Kong right up until, I think, 1997. And then it handed it back over to China with a specific agreement. And the agreement was a sort of special status. And that special status was that Hong Kong, even though it was part of China, would be treated administratively closer to the British system, higher freedoms for the people, more political representation. It's why Hong Kong has had this weird status both politically and economically. It has its own currency. It has its own forms of government that are not the same as in China. It's been given this special status as a condition of this handover agreement. And what's been happening in the last 5 years, really, since the Umbrella Revolution, and I think 2014, but really accelerating last year, is efforts by China to begin cracking down on those freedoms. And so last year, throughout the whole summer, around this time, literally this time last year, they were storming the parliament. A security law was put in place, or proposed, it hadn't even passed. It was proposed that Hong Kong criminals could be removed from Hong Kong and tried in China. The original case, I've got a whole thing on this in the Dictator's Dilemma, wasn't even a political dissident. It was a murder suspect from Japan. that prompted the whole law in the first place. But China took advantage of this opportunity to basically say, hey, we want to be able to try Hong Kong citizens in China. That caused all the protests that happened over the summer and the fall. Led almost to a state of almost insurgency between the protesters and the police. For Hong Kong, which is not a violent place, very, very violent type things. That, I mean, for US, that'd be like the 7-Eleven on Wednesday night. But for Hong Kong, very violent. You have police shootings. You have protesters using fire incendiaries on people. You have a lot of back and forth. That kind of it didn't resolve. You know, there was a big election where a lot of the protesters won the local, and we're talking neighborhood block captain, like sub-city level, neighborhood level. They won a lot of those positions. And then COVID happens and the whole thing kind of goes into slumber. China has last night, in the last 24 hours, just passed a law that no one has seen outside of the parliament. There was no transparency in this. It was rushed, and it really looked like they wanted to put this in place on today for the signifying event. And this law basically ends the autonomy of Hong Kong. I want to go over some, it's breaking fast, so this is of this morning, but here's some of the things this law is saying. It says crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forcibles are punishable by up to life in prison, right? So of course, what is foreign collusion? It's whatever China says it is, right? Subversion, terrorism, secession, these are all ways to suppress freedoms in the protest. Companies or groups that violate the national security law will be fined and could have operations suspended. This is a warning shot. There are lots of private sector companies that operate in Hong Kong as a way to get safe access into China because the Hong Kong legal system has more in common with Britain. This effectively ends that. This really risks the economic status of Hong Kong as a place you go to do safe business with China because the legal protections are now effectively gone. Damaging certain transportation vehicles and equipment can be considered an act of terrorism. This is to make sure that like subways and police cars and things like that. Anyone convicted of violating security legislation will not be allowed to stand in Hong Kong elections. This is a big suppression tactic that you see. We were talking about Ethiopia. You see in Ethiopia and countries where we use criminal punishments to prevent people from standing in elections. And then what you do is you round up all the dissidents and you charge them with a crime under this national security law, and all of a sudden none of those people can run for election. They're pretty much barred from government. This one's big. There's a new national security agency placed in Hong Kong, but the personnel that are in that security agency are Chinese and they are not under the jurisdiction of Hong Kong. It's like basically you know, imagine the CIA. Well, it's not hard to imagine, but you know, the CIA opening a full security apparatus in another country where that country does not have any jurisdiction whatsoever, and that national security agency has legal powers in that country. Huge things. Authorities can surveil and wiretap persons suspected of endangering national security. Again, this is going to be a huge wiretapping. The law. This is another part. The law will apply to permanent and non-permanent residents of Hong Kong. So non-permanent residents, all those people in Hong Kong for business are now subject to this law. I've been to Hong Kong myself. I was working for Cathay Pacific. I went over there as an IBMer. I walked by the Chinese embassy. I was tempted to take out my cell phone and take a picture or like do a selfie or something. I was told, do not mess around with that. You will get in trouble. So I just kind of walked down and gave him a finger quietly. But this isn't being recorded, is it? No, I hope not. But yeah, I've been to Hong Kong. If you're doing business in Hong Kong, you are now subject to these laws where traditionally, if you were a business person, you're kind of given some leeway. And any foreign non-government organizations and news agencies will now be managed by the Hong Kong government and this national security agency. So taken together, these laws remove the autonomy from Hong Kong because you can take criminals, you can try them in China. You've got a national security agency from China with no oversight by local jurisdiction in the city itself. There's already been protests this morning, and they're just arresting people. So this is, you know, we're all busy with COVID, and I said if anyone was going to bust a move during COVID, it wasn't going to be Russia, it was going to be China. And you see it now in India, you see it in Hong Kong. I bet we're going to see it in Taiwan and the South Philippine Sea or the South Asian Sea here pretty soon. They're starting to make moves while the rest of the world struggles with COVID, and we're entering our own presidential and have our own problems. It's going to be a big issue. So Hong Kong, not looking good right now. Tyler Brown, it sounds like it will only take one incident with a foreign business where the Chinese arrest some folks and that begins the mass exodus of foreign business over the next couple of years. Tyler, I don't even think they're going to wait for it. I think you're going to see that exodus if it, to the extent that last year's instability caused a partial exodus, I think this will simply continue and accelerate the trend. And what's interesting from a geopolitical standpoint is two of the biggest financial capitals in the world were Hong Kong and the City of London. And both of these in the last year have had major structural changes that disincent companies from basing there for the benefit of the financial. Hong Kong has had this instability and pressure from China, now these national security laws. The City of London is, of course, part of England, which is part of the United Kingdom, which is no longer part of the European Union. So I don't know where everyone's going to go. I mean, if I were in the financial world, which I'm not, I'm like, where are these people going? Are they going to New York? Are they going to Paris? They're probably not going to Moscow. Even more so, the general trade, there's a lot of trade that occurs that is fulfilled from China, but occurs in Hong Kong. Where is that going to go now? There are some countries, like the United Kingdom is being very generous in allowing Hong Kong residents to repatriate themselves or expatriate themselves into the United Kingdom. I think Mark's mentioning this as well. But that's sort of I'm getting out of Dodge. That's not available for everyone, and it doesn't help the people who are staying unless you can supply them with funds or whatever. So Ezra is asking about annexation in Israel. I haven't looked into that recently. So I'll get back to that. Berlin. I don't know what people are asking about in Berlin. Let me go back and look through questions. John's mentioning the federal structure in Canada. All good. Ed's asking, has anyone charted country statistics sorted by political unity on the pandemic response? No, but then make a great graduate student progress. Again, I don't think it's gonna show what people. I think it's going to be a mix of noise. A lot of these pandemic responses, it's easy to cherry pick the outliers. So we can say, yeah, New Zealand, we know New Zealand did well. So let's look at what New Zealand has. Well, it has a unified government. Well, okay, that means that maybe while they're doing well, but New Zealand's also an island and Hawaii is an island. So maybe we should be looking at islands. We're going to have to wait, I think, and see who did well and then what circumstances were commons. Maybe it's just islands that are doing well, regardless of government, because they're easy to isolate. There's also the learning curve. How do you treat a country like Italy, which is the first country, not that Italy has a unified government or ever has a unified government, not since Caesar probably or Augustus, but Italy was the first country in Europe to have this major outbreak. Where's the learning curve? Should you grade them as much as you do someone else? I think these kind of simple correlations of this or that are going to be problematic. Generally, countries that had experience with SARS tend to do a little better, but it's also not true that like everyone's like, oh, all these Asian countries are doing great. Well, that's not true and kind of somewhat racist. I mean, South Asian countries include Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. They're not doing great. Japan has struggled. Singapore has had a problem. They were one of the highlights early on, and they kind of stumbled. So it's a global pandemic is a global pandemic. It's a hard thing. Some countries are doing better, others aren't, and we'll see how it plays out over the long run. So, people are saying Berlin is a place for financial people. Yes, we're putting the here's the bids for new financial capital of the world. Berlin, New York City, Bangkok, Jerry, really? Good luck. Yeah, I think Berlin's reasonable. Germany is in the driver's seat for having really coming out of this pandemic well. It's at the driver's seat for the European Union. Its economy is doing pretty strong, and they've handled the pandemic well. Tyler Brown, question. Russian bounties on U.S. troops. This seems like it's a giant hole where it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Thoughts? So I've been holding back on commenting on this because it's so intelligence bound. I looked at what has been leaked at least, and it's a pretty compelling case. You've got to kind of overview for people who don't know. The high level overview is you had Taliban prisoners, when they were being interrogated, would say, we would get paid, offered bounties that would come to us through these series of people, and it would lead to Russia, and for that, we would kill Americans. First of all, offering bounties on foreign service people is not a new tactic at all. It has been done since time immemorial, and many of the deaths in these insurgent environments are almost, they're less ideological as they are criminal opportunistic. When I was studying IEDs, there were freelance networks that were basically like, you know, $500 and we'll put an IED under a truck. You know, they were advertising their services. They weren't ideologically for the Taliban or against the US. They were criminals trying to make a buck. So you have both Taliban and criminals associated with the Taliban now being interrogated saying we're getting money for this. That's not unusual. But as the pieces started to get put together, if you're in there's a system of money lending or money transfer. When you don't have formal banking systems, like in a lot of Islamic countries, there's something called the halal system, HALWAL. It is a friend of a friend. I know a guy, and he knows someone where you are. So if I give money to my friend, and he gives it to the next friend, and the friend gives it there, all of a sudden I can transfer money from locations without having to have a wire service or a formal bank. And these networks are very, very sophisticated. They exist for all sorts of legitimate reasons, but they've also been used for terrorism because they don't have a tracking mechanism. So the investigations into Russia found these halal middlemen. They had some raids a couple months ago where they actually captured some of these middlemen who had enormous amounts of cash. And from that, they were able to then go look at the wiretaps on the financial bankings of the GRU, which is the Russian military intelligence, and see transfers of money at the same time. So you have interrogations, someone says, we're getting paid by the Russians. You have middlemen captured who say, we're getting paid by the Russians, and you see financial transfers coming out. That's pretty compelling. Why Russia's doing it? The Battle of Kashman, I've mentioned a few times, was in Syria. Russia attacked a US base and got slaughtered. Between 100 to 200 Russian troops got killed. There were Wagner mercenaries. It's kind of like Russia's version of Blackwater. And probably another 200 to 500 got injured. It was a really bad deal. But at the time, both the US and Russia kind of downplayed it because you didn't want a big war breaking out. I mean, think what would happen if 200 US service people were killed, 300 were killed in a day. There'd be demand for blood. So the theory that was in 2018, February 2018. This operation was alleged to have started in late 2018, maybe 2019. So the timing fits as Russia looking for payback for the Battle of Kashman goes to this time-honored tactic of we're going to go find where our enemy's fighting and we're going to go throw some money at people who hopefully will kill them. That's not unusual. That happens quite frequently. I dare say that we probably engage in some of that as well. But what is unusual, and probably this is where I'm waiting for more, is the Nixon, the Baker test. When did they know? How did they know it? And what did they do with they know it? There's a debate about who got briefed when, what action has been taken in retaliation. That I'm letting simmer a little bit more for information to come out and to see what the decision making was. It's something we're going to touch on in a future thing, but that's the Russian bounty thing. For those who didn't know and wanted some context on the high level, I'm not going to, it's still, for me, stuff with this level of classification, I'm not going to jump on it just in a week. I'm going to give it some time and see what it says. Kevin's asking how Iran's doing. They were in an early hotspot. They're having a wave 1.52. You can look at Iran. I've got some links in there, and we have some global trackers. They have a second crest just like we do, so they're not doing well. Yeah, Ed's saying, didn't we do the same thing of the USSR in Afghanistan? Alleged. Not going to get into that. Mark saying that Islam has rules against usury that had impacts on banking. That is true. So usury, which is the charging of interest under most, both Christian and Islam, was prohibited in a large period of time as being, you were basically earning money on God's time, and that was heretical or wrong, and so they were banned. But in this case, it's so first of all, banks didn't develop in Islam, and the bank was a traditional mean of getting money transferred. This is more about money transfers, like think of Western Union, right? The ability to wire telegram. Because you didn't have banks, you didn't have this development of money changing, and as an outgrowth of that. But an informal network, the Hawal network, is worldwide, and it was very effective. So that as you have, and again, it's used for legitimate purposes. You look at the expatriates from Iran coming over to the US, you look at refugees coming into the US during asylum or things like that, or transferring out in different areas. These networks stay connected through formal and informal systems like Hawal, where they can transfer money just as effectively as Western Union, but without digits and pens and zeros. Again, a portion of this has been exploited for terrorist reasons because there's no tracking and no oversight. So that's where it can be difficult. So let me make sure I've gotten through all my topics. Of course, I've waited to the very end to say if you enjoy these conversations, please support the InfoMullet Patreon, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. A Mulleteer subscription is only $5 a month. We do these weekly. There's a lot of information in here. We're paying for the server so you can get these tracking apps. Anything helps, and we greatly appreciate those who have become Patreon supporters. So again, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. Become a Mulleteer subscriber. We really appreciate all our subscribers. As always, if you like this video, like, follow, share the InfoMullet. Share the video out on your feed. We are going to take this video, we're going to upload it in its entirety to YouTube, and then we're going to chunk it into segments. So if you really want to get the media literacy on positive testing rate or that socialized country graphic, you can just use that one media clip. Use it in Facebook, use it in Twitter, use it in whatever the kids are using these days, TikTok or whatever. and share this information. So we're trying to make it easy for folks. Let me go through and do a last walkthrough to make sure I haven't missed any questions. People worried about an eviction surge. There may be an eviction surge with people talking about the economy here. There is a cliff coming up where the rent freezes end, the payroll protection pact for businesses end, and you have this reversal in COVID. So late June is going to be a little dicey. Going through here, just looking. IBM equals Big Blue. Yes. Yes, Erez, I worked for IBM for 10 years. Yep, Chris brought up a good point. Taiwan's offering to any Hong Kong. Taiwan, another great location for a potential financial hub. I didn't think about that. They're well situated, but they're also in China's sight. So there's going to be a definite concern point there. Other questions? Oh, Fortnite. All right, everyone have a great 4th of July. Please stay safe. If you have to go outside, wear a mask, stay distant. If you don't, stay inside. Everyone be good. I'm going to close it down now. Thanks again for all the support. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and follow this. Like, follow, share the InfoMullet, and have a great 4th of July. Be safe. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a Mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.